My name is Susan Galloway, and I'm part of the Flying Squirrel Collective. This is the Flying Squirrel that you're in. It is a community space that is owned and run by members of the community, part of the collective. And we offer on Mondays, the first Monday of every month, what's called Monday Mayhem, where we have a variety of subjects and issues that we talk about that are part of the community and part of the things that we support as a collective. And we've been here for almost 9 years. We are run totally by donations, and we're really glad you came out for this. It's an important issue, and tonight we're going to have the City Roots Community Land Trust present what they're about and how they are going to help the community in Rochester and hopefully other areas as this catches on. So I will ask you all to please welcome them, and again, welcome to the Flying Squirrel Community Space.
Hello everybody. Thank you all so much for having us. A bunch of us are going to take turns presenting tonight. Our president, Joe DiFiore, he's still hanging out at our board meeting, which was going kind of long, and he'd be doing this. I'm filling in. So I'm Shane Wiegand. I live in the Beechwood neighborhood. I've been at Flying Squirrel a few times for the Police Accountability Campaign, and it's great to be here with you all. Hopefully by the end of tonight, you'll understand a little bit more about the problem we're trying to address and how we're trying to address it, and hopefully how you can help. Our plan is to kind of start with our mission and vision, and then we're going to dig into some of the history surrounding the disinvestment, especially of the inner city of Rochester, and the pattern that fits with nationally, and then how this national model of community land trust were created to help solve part of this problem, and how we're trying to do that here in Rochester. At the end, we'll definitely have time for questions. If you got a question during the middle, feel free to raise your hand up. We are a community group. So there's probably between 40 or 50 people that volunteer throughout the month with us, that helping writing grants, helping with policy. We have 12 people sitting on our board, and a bunch of them are hopefully going to be showing up soon, but they're still over at St. Joe's right now meeting. So what else can I say? So with this, we're really excited to get to share what it is that we do. We thought we were going to have a projector, but that was a fail. So I apologize for that, but luckily I have these packets, and I'm sorry if the font is too small. We're going to try to tell you what page we're on and what slide so you don't get lost. And if you feel lost, please just holler out and I'll make sure you know where you are. Sound good? Promise you'll say if you don't know where you are. Thumbs up. Yeah, alright, cool. So that's a picture of us on the first slide. It was going to be really big and beautiful, but now it's small and also beautiful. And you can take a look at the second slide, our mission. Sandra was going to read this, but she's still at the board meeting. Our mission of the City Roots Community Land Trust is to permanently preserve housing affordability in Rochester, New York through community-owned and managed land, to empower neighbors and to bridge socio and economic divisions. And hopefully we're going to get into all the nitty-gritty of what we're talking about when we talk about community-owned land and managed land, which are two different things, and what we mean by empowerment and bridging socioeconomic division. Our vision, which kind of helps explain our mission, is that the Community Land Trust our vision is to strengthen the Rochester community by cultivating the perspective that land owned by the community can help make housing a human right and affordable for all. We're a collaborative of homeowners, renters, youth, community allies, and other partners. So we're turning to page 2. You guys are doing a great job turning to page 2. That's great. I teach 4th grade, so you guys are real scary, big, and you just look a lot different from my kids. So I'm sorry if I'm talking like a teacher right now. So at the top there, this what the need we're addressing kind of goes back quite a while, all the way back to something called redlining. And essentially, I want to talk about de jure, which means legalized segregation and racism in Rochester, and kind of combat the myth that the reason Rochester is segregated has to do with de facto reasons or just sort of accidental reasons. Because we all know Rochester is a very extremely segregated, hyper-segregated place, one of the worst in the entire country. But it didn't get that way on purpose, and it didn't just get that way because white people were like, we're going to move to the suburbs. It got that way because of federal policies, local policies, and of course individual choices as well. So we're going to talk about that through the lens of redlining, restrictive covenants and racial covenants, the VA and FHA-backed mortgages, and racist suburban zoning policy, and something called block busting, which in this area I think you guys probably know a little bit more about. So if you look at that first slide, it's not in color, but if you look at the darker areas in the middle that are sort of shaped in like a half-moon crescent area, you can see where it says Market View Heights and Beechwood, pointing to the arrow on there. This is an actual 1935 redlining map, and it's something that the federal government created in almost every northern and several southern cities across the entire country. Essentially what they wanted to do is they wanted to fight poverty for white people across the country by helping white people own homes. So the federal government created the Federal Housing Authority, which in turn built something called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And they hired tens and tens of realtors right here in Rochester, people that worked for Nothnagel and other places, to walk around neighborhoods just like this neighborhood on Clarissa Street, and to check off and rate all the houses, all of the streets, based on whether or not people who were black lived there, European immigrants lived there, or based on the fact of whether or not there was like factories or any type of property that was hazardous. And they rated these areas based on whether or not they were going to back federally insured 30-year mortgages for. And so in this neighborhood, in my neighborhood in Beechwood, in the 14621 neighborhood, the 7th Ward, 3rd Ward, those were primarily the red-lined areas. And you can kind of see right there, around them were the yellow-lined areas, which were just a step a little bit better. And then if you look on the map, you can see in the bottom right, that's like Cobb's Hill. Bottom left is sort of like the 19th Ward. You've got Maplewood, and you got the Browncroft neighborhood over to the east. And so the way this essentially worked is that if you were a person that wanted to buy a house, most people, over half the loans in the entire country from 1935 through 1968, were federally insured by the FHA, or the VA, which followed the FHA rules. So that's an incredible form of affirmative action for white people, essentially, that was given out. And the way it worked is if you wanted to apply for a loan to get your house, you'd go in and you'd see your neighborhood for the house that you wanted to buy, and if you were in a red-lined neighborhood, you could not get a mortgage. But you could if it was in a green or a blue neighborhood, and your skin color was right. And if you wanted to live in a red-lined area, if you were a white person, you could own a home there as long as you were not living in it but renting it out, is kind of the way it would work. And essentially, what it did is it bought up apartments. White people would buy apartments, rent them out, or if you're an African-American person, you wanted to live in Rochester, as you know, most people were pushed into these red line areas, and if you wanted to try to buy a home, you'd do something called a covenant lease. And our very own Wallace Smith, the house that he grew up in, his dad had purchased a covenant lease from the person that owned like half the block, pretty much. And essentially with a covenant lease, you couldn't get any equity, and you didn't own your home whatsoever at all until you paid off all 20 or 30 years it took you to pay off your mortgage. And if you missed a single payment, they had a 100% legal right to evict you. This happened all over Rochester. It happened all over the entire country. It's like an insane disinvestment from people. So you couldn't borrow against your house, whereas a white family living in Cobb's Hill or in Maplewood, they could be putting money into their house, investing in their mortgage, and then also use that equity to take out other loans to improve their home, to send their kids to college. Whereas with someone like Wallace's family, they didn't have that opportunity. Next, there's something called racial covenants or restrictive covenants. And if you look at the last slide on page 2 there, that's an actual screenshot from the underwriting manual in the 1936 manual for the FHA. And you can see where I underlined it. It says, if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it's necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. And a change in social or racial occupancy leads to instability and a reduction of values. So right there, written into the law, legal discrimination. And you can see these housing restrictions built into any suburban or urban property that was built between 1935 and 1948 when the restrictive covenants were outlawed, Shelley versus Kramer. So if you turn the page to page 3, you can look up here. Here's just one example. If you're familiar with the Meadowbrook area of Brighton, it was over 300 homes, and all of those homes had restrictive covenants that the developer that built that neighborhood, they couldn't sell any home to to a black person, and then the person that owned that home couldn't sell that home to a black person, and so on. All of those covenants are still on the deeds today, although it's illegal to actually try to enforce them. But you can go into the county and you can look them up and you can see it, and it's astonishing. So this had an incredible impact, and Peter's going to come up and kind of talk about how the poverty and segregation we see today and some of those numbers, and then we're going to get more into the land trust. So this is Peter.
Hello, I'm Peter. Thank you, Shane. So yeah, as Shane was saying, there's a lot of historical things that have gone on in Rochester's housing market that have kind of been overturned in the letter of the law. Like these underwriting manuals don't say that you have to keep the quote is, if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. Those deeds, that language that you can't rent to black people, it's still in there, but it's not enforceable. And despite that, we do have a lot of effects of things that are still going. So if you look at the slide number 8, it says, what impact has housing segregation had on African Americans today? In 2011, the median white household had a net worth of $111,000 compared with $7,000 for the median black household. The next slide, you can see a map that shows owner-occupied homes, and you'll see that the same districts that were redlined back in, 1935, are the same that have the lowest amount of actual home ownership. The next slide we have
On page 4 now.
on page 4, yep. We have a slide showing density map for people that are not included in the credit economy. That means these people, their credit score is so low that they are not eligible for any type of credit, whether that's a mortgage, a home loan, a credit card, anything like that. They are just totally not included, and 15% is a very high number, and it's only in these formerly redlined neighborhoods. Population according to race, that map is pretty small, pretty hard to see, but you'll see that these neighborhoods are still predominantly black. So even though we no longer have the actual language on the books that this segregation is legally de jure, it's still very much there. It's still very de facto. It's going to be enshrined in our history, and it's going to be enshrined for years to come unless we do something about it. From the 2017 Act Rochester Hard Facts Report, that's the last slide on page 4, it says African American children in our region are more than 4 times as likely as whites to live in poverty. The median household incomes of African Americans in our region are less than half that of whites, and both African Americans and Latinos are less than half as likely to own their homes as their white counterparts. So yeah, that is what we've come to from this, really in your face about it sort of thing, to this more insidious structural racism, structural discrimination. I'm not sure who's next. Would that be you?
Hi, I'm Kat. So given the history that we know now about housing and how that has specifically led to segregation in Rochester, we kind of want to answer the question of what can we really do to address these issues, and so this is how we're tying it back to the Community Land Trust. So Community Land Trust homeowners can gain equity and financial stability, and therefore Rochester gains quality homes that are affordable for generations to come. Community land trusts matter because they counter displacement from bad gentrification. They steward neighborhood land for public good. They are a stabilizing force in the neighborhoods, and they also reduce foreclosures, which ties into adding to stability in the neighborhoods. And community land trusts are even recommended by the Monroe County Zombie Task Force. And the next slide on page 5, the bottom one, is just to show you that the community land trust was, there's a little blurb about it on the website, about the zombie task force. And
What
local,
What the zombie task force is, can you explain that a little bit?
yeah, but maybe you should come from someone who knows a little bit about it.
Yeah.
Hey guys, sorry I'm a little late. Sorry we don't have a projector. So everyone's heard of zombie homes? The zombies, you know, it was like the catchy thing that the Monroe County came up with for their task force, Zombie Home Task Force. When Adam Bella was running for county executive, it's just a way for them to look like they're addressing these foreclosed homes. We know it's kind of an epidemic in our community, and so they want to get out a little, gain some political points, and they came with this task force. They were looking for recommendations on what to do with these homes, and one of the things they came up with, really in part to some of the people you see here, was community land trust. So what if instead of the banks kind of sitting on these houses while they wait for the foreclosure to go through, what if they turn them over to community-controlled not-for-profits controlled by the community, people like yourselves, to actually take care of those houses and turn them back over to people in the community, maybe even to the people that were foreclosed on, right? Ideally, we'd get them back into their homes. So that's really what we were able to get that in there. And what's really cool about it is now every time we're talking to someone from the county, we can say, hey, this is in your report. You said you wanted community land trust. You said you wanted community-led housing, right? Let's make it happen. So that's why that's exciting. That's why we include that in the presentation. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
So how, and maybe you'll get into this later, but how does it help homeowners gain equity? I mean, I'm familiar with how land trust works, but
Sure.
Is it them against the land trust as the owner, or is it against, I mean,
What do you mean by against?
well, you've got to own the house against someone until you fully own it. And-
Oh, I see what you're talking
and
about.
under
Sure.
the land trust, you don't ever own
Sure,
it.
like who owns like the lien or something like that. Well, you always own the house. The house is what you own. You don't own the land underneath.
Okay.
So that's the big
Okay.
difference. We're separating the land from the improvement, right? In real estate, they talk about the improvement. It could be a house, it could be a building of any sort, but it's improvement. Yes.
I just wanted to find out, you had, when you were doing the history, I
Yeah.
was gonna bring this up at the end, but, I was wondering, when did this policy that they couldn't enforce, like, where people could live or where they could buy houses?
The Fair Housing Act of 1968, but
Okay,
it's been extremely negligibly enforced.
Right.
And Nixon literally changed the policy and chose not to enforce it at all.
so how long has it been enforced and how long has it been, you know,
Well, we know it's still happening today, right? It's still happening today, and there was just that big lawsuit. What was the bank that got in trouble for that?
Five-star bank.
Five Star Bank just got in trouble very recently for basically doing the exact process, redlining, modern day redlining, and it's still happening today. I mean, it's very apparent. As far as the structure, and we were going to get into a little bit later, but you know, let's be organic about it. We're separating the improvement from the land, right? And the reason why is because we understand, and I think a lot of you probably understand, is that we live in a society that's all about property rights. It's all about if you own the property, you know, this is my property, this is my castle, I can do what I want, type of thing. And if you don't own the land in your community, then you don't have a real say at the end of the day, right? The people who own the land, they're the big developers, they're the people with a lot of money. They can come into your neighborhood, they could bulldoze it, they can do whatever they want if they can buy and own the land, right? So the basic premise of the community land trust is, what if the community owned the land, right? If the community owned the land, then the community has that final say, right? We decided as a community that we want housing to be affordable in our neighborhood. We decided as a community that we want this storefront to be available for these kind of businesses that are of a benefit to the community. We decided as a community that the best use for this vacant lot is not a luxury condo development, but is a community garden, right? It may not bring in the most money, but it's providing a value to our community. So that's really what we're looking at doing with the community land trust, is putting the power in the hands of many rather than the few. Any other questions on that?
Is it off the tax roll?
Say that again?
Is it off the tax roll if it's in the trust?
So the house itself will most definitely still be on the tax roll.
Right.
Right, that's privately owned. And I should say that the community land trust is if your home is in a community land trust, then it's just like any other home ownership scenario. You're just feeling like your day to day, you're cutting your grass, you're painting your house, you're living there with your family, their ins and outs. It's all fine. You might not necessarily even know that there's a community land trust. Where the community land trust comes into play is if you have some sort of issue where you need support. Like let's say for instance you're getting behind on your mortgage payment, you fall behind and the bank decides, oh, you missed 1 payment, 2 payments, we're going to initiate foreclosure proceedings, right? In a normal scenario, it's just you against the bank, right? Those are pretty tough odds, right? We got some great organizations like Take Back the Land that have helped some people, but for the majority of people who've gone to foreclosure, it was them against these banks, often banks that don't even have a location locally, right? They're out-of-state banks. Community land trust can step in as a network of people to support you that's well-resourced because we have many people, that's well-resourced because we have funding, that's well-resourced because we have a knowledge and experience. We know that you can get, we can put you in contact with Empire Justice or Law New York. We know how to get you Chapter 13 or whatever you need to get through, and we know how to negotiate with the banks to get you a mortgage modification that's going to be fair and equitable, right, and manageable, and not something that's going to be even more than when you previously negotiated with. All that to say, the tax question. The private ownership is still treated as private ownership. So the house is taxed by the city as it would be otherwise. Where that changes a little bit, and we'll get into this in a minute, is the home is going to be limited in the amount it can be sold for. That's a big part of what the community land trust is doing, right? So if a person comes up to the community land trust and says, love what you guys are doing, I really want to become a homeowner, I don't have a lot of money, but I feel like if it was an affordable price, I could make the mortgage payments, right? We say, okay, we're going to sell you this home at $40,000. Let's say the houses around it are $80,000, $100,000 houses. And we as a community decide that the affordable price that we set as a community, not this baloney area median income based on Monroe County where it's like, you know, oh yeah, if you make $55,000 a year, like you qualify for affordable housing or something ridiculous like that. But for people who actually aren't making a lot of money that need affordable housing, we might set that price at say $40,000, just as something for example. If the surrounding houses are say $80,000, we've sold it at considerably less than what the market value is. So we gave that person a really great deal. Well, the idea behind the community land trust is if that person decides to sell in the future, that they'll give the next person who needs a hand up, they'll give the next person a really good deal, right? So they're not going to get the house for $40,000, decide, ooh, I got mine, and then the next year, 2 years, turn around and sell it for $100,000 and walk away with $60,000, right? While the community just invested in that one person, right? That's individual wealth. What we're talking about is building community wealth for the community as a whole, right? That's what we're interested in doing. So the person can still build some equity in the house. There's allowance for equity. The house can appreciate, and they can take that equity out when they leave. Whatever they put into the house, they get back out. But they're not going to turn around and in a speculative market where there's kind of runaway inflation on housing prices, they're not going to be able to, again, sell it for $100,000, walk away and divest from that neighborhood, that community, after the community's just invested in that. The land could potentially be tax deductible, depending on the municipality's willingness to do so, and the assessment on the house can be lower based on, again, that resale formula. So if the house being the community land trust says that the house can only be sold for $80,000, the city can't very well then assess the house for $100,000, right? Because the assessment is based on what the house could be sold for, potentially. If you present to the assessor that you have a house that is capped at $80,000, your assessment is then lowered, right? Because you can't have it, can't can't sell it for that price. So that's where the taxes come into play. It's a little easier to demonstrate if we have a slide, but
The reason I ask,
you have,
sorry.
are you agreeing with that, or you have
Yeah, I'm
thoughts on
saying brilliant.
that? Okay, okay.
The reason I ask is like in rural areas where there's land trust for conservancy,
Yes.
there's a lot of resistance from folks because it's taken off the tax rolls and they
Correct.
think it negatively affects them
Correct.
by making their taxes higher. And
Mhm.
I'm not super familiar with taxes in the city, but
Mhm.
I mean, I'll ask later what some of
Right.
the resistance is because I'm sure you get into it.
Yeah, so so I should say, maybe we talked about this a little bit, and I want to hand it back over to some other people because this is kind of really a group effort, but there are over 250 community land trusts throughout the country. This is a decades-long movement. It's really well established. It's out of the civil rights era movement. Got to start in Georgia. I think, did you guys cover that?
You're just taking over Matt's. That's Matt.
Matt, come on in, Matt.
This is
Talk about
Matt, he'll take it over.
Come on, Matt.
Also, if anybody's thirsty, you can grab a cup of water out of the kitchen there. Feel free. So we're on page 6 here. First slide. Land trust allows for development without displacement, which is great because I've heard a couple presentations from urban planners around the country, and then when somebody asks, well, you know, you improve this neighborhood, you improve this street, this block, whatever it is, and the house prices go up, what happens to the people who live there already and can't now afford the heightened property taxes? And they say, well, that's just how it is. This is part of the, you know, this is part of the game. You want to improve it, people are going to have to move out. So what a land trust allows for is that investment in the community, in that neighborhood, in that block, and allows people who want to stay in their homes. So that's what I mean by development without displacement. As you can see, there's a video here. Don't have the technology yet to play this from the paper, but basically just talking about the Albany Community Land Trust, which is a pretty old land trust, 30 years.
80.
Yeah, just right down 90 there. They have a really great partnership with their city and county as well. Basically, the video is just talking about how people wouldn't have been able to own a home without being in the land trust and how it's a support system for them. And like Joe was starting to say, CLTs were founded in Georgia in the 1970s by civil rights leaders. Basically, it allowed for farmers to collectively own a very large piece of land and farm it together. So on the next page here, some other nearby CLTs, one in Albany, Champlain Housing Trust in Burlington, Vermont, started in, I think, 81 or 82. They actually own 8% of the housing in Burlington, Vermont, which is interesting because Burlington has been repeatedly voted one of the best places to live in the country, partially due to the housing affordability. The Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative in the Dudley area, in the Roxbury area in Boston. They actually got the power of eminent domain through their city, so they could, they never actually had to use it, they just had to threaten absentee vacant lot owners or absentee landlords and say, hey, sell us this land or we're just going to use the power of eminent domain and we're going to take it from you. So,
Sorry, Matt.
yeah,
Did you say 80% in Burlington?
8%,
8.
yeah. Yeah.
80 would have been really great.
Yeah.
What is that 8%? I'm
Yeah.
sorry. 8%.
Yeah.
8%.
They were started with a couple $100,000 from the city's coffers when actually Bernie Sanders was mayor of Burlington. So as you can see, all these dots here, Joe said there's about 250 or so land trusts all across the country. Urban community land trusts have been around for decades at this point. Rochester is a little bit behind on this. There's one in Buffalo, Albany, there's quite a few in New York. Syracuse as well. And you can see here, it's a little small print, but land trusts had access to less than 2,000 housing units in 91, and by 2010 that was 9,543, so it's really started to pick up traction. Yeah, in 2011 there, 242 land trusts, so since then, total numbers have increased. So, I'll hand it over to Marie.
Hello everyone, my name is Marie Mesa. I'm a board member and secretary, and I work for House of Mercy and REACH and also Community Land Trust, and I got involved with it because, all, it's under great leadership and great individuals, and it's just overall a great strategy to give people that empowerment that they need for housing. And I've seen the predicament that someone can be in if they don't have a place to live, and I think it's a human right, and I feel very strongly about it. That's why we're here. So for my slide, it would be 79% of residents who are first-time homeowners through the land trust, and percentage of residents with income less than 50% of areas median 82%. Basically, just the permanent affordability, pretty much for a lot of individuals that wouldn't normally be able to own a home in specific neighborhoods, specific houses, and just it really gives the opportunity for families to provide for themselves and be independent and have a place to live and have a place to work, because now you have a place to live, and that sort of thing, and just creating that community empowerment through permanent housing. And then my second slide would be that in 2010, homeowners who own inside a community land trust were 10 times less likely to go into foreclosure than homeowners who weren't part of a land trust. And that's very dear and close to my heart, because I'm actually in California and I've been here for a year or a year and a half. So I've met, unfortunately, a lot of individuals that have lost their homes. Maybe because and through the actual, none of them were through community land trust, obviously, because they never maybe would have lost their homes. And I say this because it's very heartbreaking to see that, to see people pushed out of their neighborhoods and just lose their houses and not really have a place to go, and and especially if they have young children, what are they going to do? So I've met several families that have lost their homes, like I said. So this is the reason that I got involved with community land trust. So that displacement doesn't happen. We don't have to, in order to a community to develop, we don't have to displace others. And we can just include them. And so recently we got involved with the Liz McGriff, and something that I'm very proud of, to be friends with individuals that were willing to stand up for such a cause, and the Liz McGriff, and so she can rebuy her house, and that is why I'm part of Community Land Trust. Thank you.
Marie, can you tell people a little bit about Liz's situation for those who might not know?
Well, of course, but I mean, you can just, is it okay if you take over?
It's okay with me.
Yes, no, please do, because I think you're way more familiar. I am, but I think maybe better at explaining that. Is that okay?
Well, sure. We can send yeah, so just so those of you who don't know, Liz McGriff, there was just a great article in the DNC about her. She's really nothing short of a local hero, in my opinion. So she was really battling an unjust foreclosure on her home for several years. She's finally able to emerge victorious, thanks to the help of a lot of support from the community and a lot of courage on her part. She was able to purchase the home back from the bank at a fair price, and so she is now the homeowner of her home, free and clear, no bank involvement, and it will be the first community land trust home. So we were really excited to be able to play a very small role as an organization. Liz and St. Joe's House of Hospitality and Take Back the Land really been supporting her for years, and Community Land Trust really came onto the scene towards the tail end of that, but it's a pretty huge victory for not just Community Land Trust or any of those organizations, but for Liz and for our community in general. So that's a point that is really worth hammering home, big victory for Liz. So.
It takes a village.
Yeah.
Now, I just have a question. So
Sure.
did the bank forgive the note?
So the terms of the agreement with the bank, she's subject to a confidentiality agreement. So can't really say that, but you can look up what the sale price was recorded for. It's public record and it is in the DNC article, so you can kind of get that.
No, the reason why, because I
Yep.
guess I misunderstood. I thought you said that now the community land trust owns the land.
So Liz is so as part of the whole as part of the whole arrangement or negotiation, the land will be going to the community land trust. That Liz is donating the land to the community land trust. So I guess one further altruistic heroic effort on her part. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
No, so, but she owns the house.
Correct.
Free and clear.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Absolutely.
Do you want questions now, or do you want us to just hold them?
I'm the kind of person that's happy to take them either way.
Okay, I've
And,
got two. Are all houses in a community land trust owner occupied?
No, not necessarily. They could be rental properties as well, and they don't even have to be houses, as I alluded to before. They could be parkland. They could be for a solar installation. It could be for a playground. It could be a commercial property. Whatever, the community. It's really about just community control and what the community determines is the best use for a property. So.
For something like a park, then is the land trust responsible for upkeep?
Well, that would depend on the situation, right? So the land trust could opt to be the steward of that park, or, for instance, there's an organization in Russia, the Taproot Collective, and they work for urban farming. So we might decide, hey, there's some vacant land here. Community land trust doesn't do urban farming. Community land trust stewards the land for the good of the community. So we're going to have a memorandum of understanding or some kind of agreement with the Taproot Collective. They're going to farm the land, lease it from the Community Land Trust. If and when they can no longer do so, the Community Land Trust will then determine, okay, what is the best use at this point? Work with another organization, but it's open and that it's flexible. But the core of it is that it's at the behest of the community, right? That's what it all boils down to is the community. It's not people coming in from outside your neighborhood saying, hey, we have a bunch of funding, which we're willing to help you with if you use it in a certain way, right? It's just people from the community saying, this is what we want, now we own it, now we're going to do with it what we want, and to me that's really cool, that's really powerful.
I have another one.
Yeah.
Is the land trust ever the mortgage holder?
Could be, yeah. We would not. So the Burlington, that Champlain Housing Trust in Burlington, Vermont, the biggest land trust in the country. Their annual budget is $10 million a year. So they can finance their own development. They can be mortgage lender, etc. City Roots Community Land Trust is not financing any mortgages at the moment, unless one of you wants to, give us a bunch of money, and then you'd be happy to lend it out.
I'm just a little confused about how you separate the landowner and the property owner.
Mm-hmm.
It's just kind of confusing me. But you said Liz was able to, so she owned the land and the property, and so she was able to. So, because I don't even know, do we own the land? Here?
You talking to me?
Here. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
We own the land?
You pay taxes on the land?
Yep.
So who you pay taxes to?
The city and the.
That's who owns it?
That's what I thought.
That's
what I thought.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So that's a different argument, and I would say that's kind of an existential argument. Like, can you ever really own land when that land is taxed by a government, and does the government then actually own your land? That's a whole nother discussion, and I would argue. But the point being, it's pretty standard practice. It's actually a lot more common in commercial real estate, where you might have a McDonald's, for instance, right? The McDonald's Corporation selects a site, they own that site, and then they tell you, as a person who wants to own a McDonald's franchise, they say, yeah, you can build your McDonald's on this site that we own. Right? And what that does for McDonald's is it gives them control. You got to use the secret sauce. You got to cook your french fries for 5.3 minutes and everything else. And if you don't, then you can't use our land anymore. And the person who owns the McDonald's building is like, well, if I can't use your land anymore, then I invested in this building for no reason, right? So that's a pretty common, not just for McDonald's, but for a lot of other commercial businesses. You can do the same thing for residential property, right? A common example in, I guess, residential might be in condos, right? So you own your condo, right? You own your apartment in that scenario, but you don't actually own the building itself, perhaps, or you don't own the ground that the building's on, but you still own your apartment, you still own your condo, right? So that's accepted practice. We think of it a lot in New York City, for instance, would be the closest example. It's really common there. Not so common in Rochester, but it's pretty standard practice in real estate. We just don't tend to think of it as something we use for individual homeowners.
So one more question
Yeah,
I
go for
had.
it.
You were talking about some lease thing your dad had or something?
Covenant
Covenant lease.
yeah.
What is that? Same thing as rent to own?
It's like
No.
Because
It's a contract issue. You didn't have a deed.
yeah, that's how they do it. Rent to own. Okay.
Yeah, right.
Have you heard
They're
of the
still-
Woodlawn,
they're still
Woodlawn
doing it.
organization in Chicago? Saul Alinsky in Chicago, the Woodlawn
Yep,
neighborhood
I have.
organization.
Yep.
That was one of the number one things they fought against. It was like 80% of the Woodlawn neighborhood had covenant
Yeah.
leases. And that's the same. What's happening here?
Yeah. So it does have a lot of the rent to own agreements are scams, right? They have all these clauses in it. If you do this or that, you lose like all the equity put in and you get put out, right? So it was similar. I think the difference is it was a lot more overt than it is now. It's still happening, but it was a lot more overt then, where it was like, and sometimes it could have been that someone was maybe doing it for maybe like a well-meaning, good white person maybe could have bought a house and had a covenant lease. That could have been a possibility. Because people couldn't get mortgages. People of color couldn't get mortgages, couldn't buy houses in certain neighborhoods, right? So you would have needed a white person to buy the house on your behalf and then have some sort of agreement with that person. But unfortunately, that created a power differential, right? Where it was too easy to exploit the people that you were buying the house that you were, supposedly representing. So it's still happening, like you said, with the rent to own. Yeah, unfortunately.
Does the land trust make the property immune to eminent domain?
No.
No.
But the nice thing.
Conservancy, it does.
Oh, that's right. That's interesting.
So,
But
if you have a conservancy that's a land trust, then the government can never mine there for resources or build a highway through it. That's part of the reason that's a land trust, is so it's taken on, and that's also why it's taken off tax roll.
I'd have to look into that more. I don't know about that, but where I would speak to that is that if you are, so is everyone familiar with eminent domain and how that works? I'm seeing a lot of nods. So, okay. So basically, you don't have a choice, and you accept what the government wants to pay you for your property. That's the short of it. With the community land trust, one potential nice part about it is, so there's that's what you have nothing. There's nothing you can do to stop that from the government. Okay, legally, there's nothing you can do. You can argue with them and try to get more money. That's something you can do, but you can't stop the sale legally. Where you can potentially stop the sale through eminent domain is through politics, right? So, as an individual, if the government's taking my property and I'm like, no, don't take my property, right? They're gonna be like, who are you? Nobody cares. Take my property. But if you have a whole group, a whole room full of people standing behind you, and you show up at City Hall and you start squawking, right, and making it an issue, and maybe it's an election year or whatever, you got a pretty good chance, right? Now it's a little more balanced, right? So again, it comes down to that community effort, right? We're not in it alone. We're supporting each other's community. We're bonded through collective ownership and collective vision and kind of in it together type of mentality, right? Which is, from my own ethics and viewpoint, I think we're stronger together in all things, and I believe in cooperation over competition and coming together versus individualism. If you believe in individualism and amassing personal wealth over, the benefit of other people, then you probably aren't for the community land trust. But if you like the idea of supporting your fellow community members, I would submit that this is a model that you might want to support.
I have two related questions. So one is, how does land or does property come into the land trust?
Mm-hmm.
And then the second one is kind of related, I guess. So the community land trust, it seems like a kind of a community protective mechanism for maintaining control over property and over land. And you mentioned that you can control the price of the house, like to keep it affordable. So as you talked about, poverty is really concentrated in Rochester, and it's really concentrated along the racial line. So you have, more poverty in the neighborhoods of color. So how does this, so I can sort of potentially see this being a protective mechanism for possibly white people who already have the property to come into the land trust, or they have more opportunities to buy property from the land trust, at a reduced price. So you kind of built this as a historical, as kind of an antidote to historical discrimination, but at the same time, like, how do you not perpetuate that when white people already kind of have more property, more money, and more ability to come into the land trust and buy from?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, I think the first question will also help answer the second question. So the ways that the property is acquired or comes into the community land trust, there's a few different ways. One might be, this is probably the least likely scenario, but if we want to be positive, it could be a likely scenario, is that people who are altruistic, that are on good financial footing, will decide that they believe in the cause of the community land trust, and they will donate their property to the community land trust. So that's a possibility. And actually, a number of people have approached us about doing that. So there's a handful. I don't think it's going to be the majority of people. It's not going to be out-of-town investors that are looking to maximize profits. They're not going to think so. And the reason being, and this starts to answer your question, is that it is a bad, from a capitalist maximize individual wealth perspective, it's a bad business move to acquire land in a community land trust, right? Because you're basically limiting your profit margins, right? People who invest in real estate are speculating on a market. That's what you do. You buy low in a market where you think that property values are going to increase, right? So I wouldn't go, we could say like neighborhood X has low property values. And I'm thinking, well, man, this house in Rochester, neighborhood X, because you can get a $25,000 house. It's like, I'm going to buy 50 houses, which people do. They got a lot of money, apparently. But they buy 50 houses, and they just sit on them, because they don't care. And their thought is that eventually those houses will appreciate in value. They're not going to get much cheaper than that. And if they double in price to $50,000, which isn't much for a house, then I've doubled my money, right? So if they were to buy a house in a community land trust, the community land trust is limiting what they can sell those houses for. And therefore, they would never do that because there's all these houses that are available that aren't in the community land trust, right?
What if they start their own? Is that more kind of what you're saying?
No, I wasn't really thinking about this, kind of this model. I was thinking about just individuals, coming into the land trust and buying from the land trust, like white families or white individuals, not so much landlords and people.
Right. Well, to answer your question, you couldn't just start your own for-profit community land trust because they're not for profits.
I'm not saying for profit, but if you have a bunch of rich landowners who say that we want to make our community ours and start.
That wouldn't be a community land trust because a community land trust is a not-for-profit, right? That's recognized. So good luck selling to the IRS that a rich white people club is a not-for-profit. Well, I guess there's lots of those that are not-for-profits. But take that back. But the community land trust structure that itself, I think, would not fly for that effort. But so people who are coming to the community land trust have to income qualify to buy. Is one answer to your question, right? And then so no one who's wealthy is going to be able to buy one of these homes, right? You can't, and you also can't buy the home and then flip it, right? You can't buy low from the community land trust and then sell it the next year for a big increase, right? That's all built in, that's all been thought out, and that's where it comes into what I was saying before, that this is a well-established model that places this is a model that comes from communities of color, okay? So they've thought about these angles, and they've figured it out over decades, and they have a model ground lease that kind of comes through and addresses like all these little like, well, what if this person tried to game it in this way, right? They've thought of all that, and there's like a whole they've got a 425-page document that like outlines like this is what happens in this scenario, and this is this and this and this. So and then they've got a whole community, like a national network. They got even got a Facebook group where you can go on and talk to other community land trusts and say, how did you deal with this? Like worried about this happening, etc., right? So now that's another thing. So what happens if our board though gets usurped, and now it's all a bunch of rich white people running the board, and now they're making all the decisions, right? So that's one scenario that's a potential. Well, what a community land trust, the standard model to do for your board is to have a three-part board. The first part is, and I think this is on, what slide is that?
This is slide 11 at the very top.
Yeah, slide 11 at the very top there. This is Wallace's slide. Do you mind if I do this for you? So Wallace, myself, and Marie are three of the board members, right? We just came from a board meeting tonight, which is why we were a little late. But it's a three-part structure. So the first part is residents of community land trust homes, right? So if you're in the community land trust, you own a home that's on the community land trust property, or you rent from a community land trust, you are a member of that demographic, you have a vote, and you only have a vote, right? So if I don't live in one of those houses, and I'm not one of those, if I don't live in one of those houses, a community land trust home, I don't get a vote over who represents me as a person who lives in a community land trust home, right? So if Marie's living in that home, she's going to vote. She gets a vote on who represents her, right? If I live in that community, I get a vote for who represents me in that community, right? If I don't live in that community, then I don't get any vote. Right? So if I live in Pittsford, I don't get any vote over what happens in the Beechwood neighborhood, right? Which is where I live. And if I do live in the Beechwood neighborhood, but I don't live in a community land trust home, then I don't get a vote over who represents the people who do live in community land trust homes, right? So that's the 2/3. The 2/3 is always top-heavy towards community residents. It's always 2/3 community residents. They control it no matter what. Then that 2/3 decides who the final third will be. So that 2/3 of people from the community can decide, okay, we recognize we're lay people, we don't necessarily understand the in and outs of real estate laws. We want to have an attorney on our board, right? We want to have someone who understands financials. We want to understand blah, blah. So there's 4 slots for people that are kind of the experts or the stakeholders. Or it could be that we decide we don't need those people at all. We're just going to do 4 more people from the community. There's regular Joes. And then we just have an advisory committee that doesn't have any power at all over our board, right? And so they could just be like, you can advise us. You don't have any sway. Before, maybe it was just 1/3. They had a little bit of influence over the other 2/3. But ultimately, you can't be usurped by outside influences. And so it's always going to be people from the community doing what's best for their community. Of course, you know, are there scenarios where things could happen? Of course. But we want to ensure, to the best of our abilities, that it's going to be community-led and community-driven, right? And that's not a model that we often see in our community or in communities anywhere, right? You look at these boards like other not-for-profits, it's a lot of times it's the same people on the boards, right? It's the wealthy foundation, it's people who don't live in the communities, and they're coming in and they have the answer, and they always want to help, but they never want to let go of the power, right? So it's like, I'll give you the money, and they're like, okay, the people in the community are like, well, let's do this with the money. And they're like, well, I don't know, I'd rather do this with the money, and since they actually have the money, that's what ends up getting done, right? Because, again, you don't own the land, you don't have the money, you don't have any real say or control. So what we're saying is, we'll fundraise, we'll get our own money, we'll buy our own land, we'll control it ourselves, and we'll decide as a community what we want to do, right?
I think another way too is like applying for grants through developers like NEED and NCS, where essentially like when they apply for affordable housing, there's lots of grants out there to build affordable housing, like the big block that's going in the Jasana neighborhood or in Beechwood. There's all kinds of activity towards development happening. And what we want to do as a community land trust is to fight to make sure that we're a part of those decisions, and that a good percentage of that affordable housing gets donated into being land trust land as a stipulation. And then when the property that's affordable is really only affordable usually for 15 to 30 years max, if we're in there, then that white developer or the wealthy developer can't turn around and sell it for market rate when a neighborhood like Beechwood, which is a transitionary neighborhood, starts to turn around. You know, the neighborhood of the arts used to be like a red line neighborhood and pretty low income, whereas now, I mean, it's pretty expensive in neighborhood of the arts or Southwood.
So then, is rezoning a similar process to how it is now?
Can you elaborate?
If you have a residential plot of land and the community votes to make it commercial, you know, how does that work through the legal system?
So so the community, the way that works, so the community petitions, right? They don't, I mean, you could characterize it as voting, but you get like 80+% of the community would petition to have a change of zoning, and that would be maybe area-wide, right? Specific zoning changes go to the planning, to the various city boards, right? The planning commission, the zoning boards of appeal, and that process would remain the same. That would be on an individual property basis, but that would be a petition brought forth by the community land trust in conjunction with the homeowner or the owner of the improvement. Yeah. So the process would remain largely the same. In that sense, you know, that's not really wouldn't be a very common scenario necessarily, but hopefully the city's going to rework their zoning a bit sooner rather than later, but it's kind of another topic.
Yes.
You guys, anyone else want to jump in? Let's see,
Yeah.
jump up here and we can get some of the other people to answer questions, so it's not just me. You know, there's a lot of them.
I think you're doing a good job. So here's my question. I'm a little confused and
Sure.
perplexed
Great.
about the community land trust, because you mentioned about how you can, somebody can buy a whole bunch of $25,000 homes.
Uh-huh,
That's what you said.
yes.
Then why doesn't your organization help people to buy these $25,000 homes?
Mhm.
Because there are so many in that price range
Mhm.
that people live in, and they pay more in rent than they would a mortgage. And they would build on that equity, like you said, and someone else said. Then that changes a whole neighborhood when it's a combination of homeowners and renters compared to a swath of just rental properties. And part of the problem is, well, it's multifold. So, but I'm just saying, it's very difficult for anyone to get a mortgage on a $25,000 home.
Correct. So.
And for a person of color, you might as well forget it.
Yeah, and in fact, I don't think, so normally, so first of all, to say, like, that's exactly what we want to do. That's what we want to do as community land trust, is buy those properties. I mean, ideally even from.
Well, why buy the properties when you have people that, I mean, if you would just assist them and be perhaps the mortgagee?
Oh, well, because they're already owned by someone else, right? So we'd have to, so it's probably owned by someone in Australia or Israel or France or somewhere else.
Or
So,
someone here,
what's that?
or someone here. I mean, they're not all out of town.
They aren't, so I'm on the board for a neighborhood association, the Beechwood neighborhood, and we deal a lot with out-of-town landlords, and getting in touch with them is not an easy process. Not for a neighborhood association, not for the city of Rochester, and certainly not for a community land trust. Like that's a big struggle. That's why the whole legislation around having a local representative have to be registered with the city just went through city council. But even that is difficult to enforce. But I get what you're saying, and I like the idea. And yeah, if we could work with a property owner that's willing to sell to a tenant, certainly we'd love to do that. I think. Oh, yeah,
Well, then I have one, because
Okay.
I'm a steward of the Kai Street Block Club.
Uh-huh.
And we have a gentleman who is raising 2 sons, okay? And they're in our programs. He has been paying on this rent-to-own program, going on 3 years now, because we got an extension. He's been paying an additional $200 a month, which the landlord wrote the contract for him to purchase it. And he had 2 years to get a mortgage. Now, the gentleman I'm speaking about had no clue on how do I go about getting a mortgage, right? So we stepped in to try and help him. Now, this money of $200 a month is supposed to help to go to closing costs. So that was the whole idea. And if he doesn't get a mortgage in 2 years, the landlord gets it plus the rest of the regular rent. I went with him and several other people to various mortgage institutions. And the gentleman has guaranteed income because he's on Social Security, and
Right.
his children are until they're 18 and they're 11 and 12. He's paying $950 a month right now. Okay, and the landlord will sell him the house for $39,000, which is a little bit high, but that's all right. Okay, so but he doesn't have the credit. See,
So
he's
when
got
you
the income, and he has the desire, and he has reference letters and all of that.
right. So what I would first I'll make a recommendation if he hasn't already is to reach out to NACA. Are they still working on a need, Wallace?
They're on, yeah.
They're on doing that, but he can get a hold of them through need. So it's NCA, and they do like 0%. What's that?
NACA.
NACA, yeah, excuse me.
Where are they
NACA.
located?
What's
What's
that?
their address?
For all intents and purposes now, 360 West Avenue, okay, but they have an alternate location on Clinton Avenue, I don't know what it is, but to come to 360 West Avenue, we'll give you the information, okay?
So you're
So
saying
360
that they provide mortgages?
They do financing, yeah.
They
Yeah.
do financing?
For
and-
people in that situation, potential. I'm not guaranteeing that they will, but that's what they do.
He does not have credit.
That's so that they work with people and
Well,
those
I
kinds
don't
of
want to hear about working with, and you know why?
Well,
Because there are, no,
I'm
you
just
know-
putting- I'm putting out there as an
Yes,
option, yeah.
That's another racket, where we're
Yeah,
going to.
they're a good organization.
Pardon me?
They're a good organization.
Okay,
They'll work
well,
with that. I mean, that's who's gonna help. If anyone's gonna help in the Rochester area, it's gonna be that organization.
No, I will, because see, there's a whole underlining to all of this. There is so
Oh, I agree. You're right.
many people that are renters, that are tenants, that can buy a house.
Right. So what we want to do is so we recognize Rochester is roughly 63% renters, right? So it's a majority, it's a super majority of people in the city that are renting, right? Unfortunately, that power isn't recognized or exercised as it might be. We're starting to see inklings of that with the tenant union, which is another great organization you need to reach out to, the Rochester Tenant Union. They might be interested in that. I know they're looking to advocate for people in situations like that. But
Give him the money to buy the house. That's all we need. I mean,
yeah,
it's
I will
a
say
simple-
that we're a startup organization, right? So there's lots of people that are in those situations that we want to help out. We have a limited amount of funds. We're fundraising now currently. The idea is we can't go in and force anyone to sell their house, right? So if you have a landlord that has a rent-to-own agreement, that landlord has probably done that rent-to-own agreement because they recognize that it's probably going to be difficult to make good on that agreement, and there's a good chance that landlord will get to take all the rent money, right? That's why they do that. And because that's why they do that, they're not likely to sell to an organization, a not-for-profit like Community Land Trust, because what's in it for them money-wise, right? They're in it for the money, right? So the Community Land Trust has to go to houses or people who are willing to buy initially and buy it at reasonable prices, and then work with people to get them, if they want to, into the homes to become homeowners. Some people don't want to own, some people want to rent, some people want ready to own, and they want to work up to that point until they feel that they're in a position where they can own. We want to work with that. We want to come up with alternative options like you alluded to before. Banks will not give you a mortgage for less than $35,000. So if you have a house, and even if you are in good standing, and you could only afford a $30,000 mortgage, for instance, you're not going to find someone to finance you at $30,000, right? There could be situations where you have a large house that's maybe 2-unit, maybe was built as 2 units, and you just want to live in your apartment. You love your apartment, you've been renting there, you could buy, but you don't need that much space, right? Your apartment's what you need. You could buy your apartment, right? That's a completely legitimate legal mechanism that exists, limited equity co-ops, where you could buy your apartment, someone else could buy the other half of your apartment. The issue being, if your house is, say, a $45,000 house, you can't get a mortgage for that small amount to buy that unit, right? So there's a lot of creative scenarios. We've been working with the Rochester Monroe Anti-Poverty Initiative to try to put pressure, not just on the local level, but on the state level to get some policy changes around there. I'm sure the tenant union will be interested in taking up these rent-to-own agreements and putting some more enforcement behind them, as far as like what's predatory, which I think we know a lot of them are. But I would really encourage you to reach out to those 2 organizations, the Rochester Tenant Union and NACA would be really good one.
So Joe, you started to list off the ways that land comes into the community land trust.
Yes.
I don't think you finished that.
Right,
list.
yeah, thank you. So the first one was someone might make a donation, right? We've had several people look to do that, Liz being one of them. 2 would be the community land trust would acquire the property, right, on the open market, right? We would say, okay, this house is on NothMingle.com or whatever. We purchase it, and then we put the land into the community land trust, and then we sell the house to a first-time home buyer or an income. Well, it would always be an income qualifying home buyer. Might be first time, might not be. Depends on the situation. We would then say, might be the community land trust in that scenario would say, we bought the house for $40,000. We're going to put a new roof on it, maybe upgrade the appliances or do something along those lines. And now we're going to sell it. We put $12,000 into it. We bought it for $40,000. We're going to sell it back for $40,000. And that was kind of subsidized, right? Because we absorbed that $12,000. That person gets a deal. They've income qualified. They're in. They live in the house. They're good to go. Any issues, the land trust is there to support them. They go to sell. They sell it at an affordable price. So that's the second scenario. The third would be to partner with something like a municipal land bank, right? Is everyone familiar with the land bank and what that does?
No.
Let's see. All right. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about that. So what the land bank does, New York State has legislation that allows municipalities to set up something called a land bank. And basically what it is a way for, it's a quasi-governmental institution that allows the government to buy land from itself, buy property from itself, right? So when there's a tax foreclosure, someone hasn't paid their taxes, the city can then initiate a foreclosure, right? And they can take your home and then they sell it at an auction. There's a tax auction. The minimum bid at that auction is the amount of taxes owed. So if you owed $6,000 on your house and the city took it, the starting bid would be $6,000. And then someone could go and bid $6,000, another person could bid $7,000, and on until going, gone. Right? What the land bank allows the city to do is say, before any of those houses go to auction, the land bank chooses the houses that it wants on that list, and then it does a trump bid, and its trump bid is the minimum bid. So if it was $6,000, instead of competing with everyone else and bidding that up, and then the land bank finally saying, okay, we'll buy it for $20,000. The land bank just says trump bid, $6,000 land bank property. Okay. So then what the land bank does now is then the land bank facilitates its transfer to some sort of developer that rehabs the house, sells it to a first-time home buyer at an affordable price. The problem is it's often not affordable because it's above market value because they're putting a lot of money in and then they're selling it, say other houses are $50,000, $60,000 houses, they might sell it for $80,000, $85,000, $90,000. So it's above market. But they've also put in maybe $110,000 into this house because they do everything. They take out the asbestos, the lead, maybe they rebuild the porch, new roof, new siding. The quality of what they do is, in my opinion, sometimes questionable, but the point is they put a lot of money in and then they sell it at a big loss. Okay? So that's kind of what the Community Land Trust is doing a little bit. We're buying a house, we're investing in it a little bit, improving it, and selling it at a loss, and selling it to someone who income qualifies at an affordable price. The difference being, what the Community Land Trust is doing is keeping it permanently affordable, right? So we're taking this money from the community, we're investing it in an individual, and we're saying, okay, but this is a community investment. We can't just take this community investment and say, do with it what you will, and then that person turns around and sells it for whatever they want in the future. Because when they do that, what do we as a community have to do? There's still a need for affordable housing, right? So now we have to go and make another affordable housing unit, and then another affordable housing unit, and then another. And and if we're successful, right, we're fixing up these houses, making the neighborhoods nicer, the next time we want to do it, it's going to cost even more because now the house is valued more, right? So the public subsidy is ever increasing, ever increasing, ever increasing. With the Community Land Trust, we do the subsidy once, now it's permanently affordable, right? It's fiscally responsible in addition to being morally, ethically responsible, right? So what the Community Land Trust can do is partner with a municipal land bank, right? The land bank is really good at acquiring property because they have that trump bid. So they could take 50 houses off that. And I'm talking about hundreds of houses. Every year, hundreds of houses are at these tax auctions. People who lose their home just to the taxes. We're not even talking about mortgage foreclosures, right? Hundreds of houses. That's just the city. County has their own auction. The land bank could take 50 houses off of that, and then they can put them around. They could put those into Community Land Trust homes, then facilitate the development, either with the Community Land Trust or with another organization. But now we know it's permanently affordable, fiscally responsible, a much better way to do it. So a lot of municipalities have done that. It's a good way to grow your Community Land Trust, and it's a good way to, again, be fiscally responsible with public dollars. So that would be the third, probably likely scenario. There's other like little things where land could come into play, but those would be the three most likely. Donation, acquiring on the open market, and with the help of a municipality through the Community Land Bank.
So Joe?
Yeah.
Our land bank, have
Yes.
they expressed any interest in partnering?
Yes. Yeah. Do you want to talk about that, Matt?
Yeah. So we've actually met with a couple members of the land bank, Dana Miller, Andrew Gazetta, Andrea G. And they've expressed interest in it. Didn't really commit to anything. And then I kind of crashed their presentation to City Council last week, and they want to partner with us for this program through Enterprise called Neighbors for Neighborhoods, which is basically, right now they have 4 houses left out of the 5 houses for this program. Enterprise is giving them $100,000 to rehab each unit, and what the land bank has to do is find somebody who wants to become a landlord, and the landlord has to put some money down for the rehab, but they get $100,000 through this Enterprise program, and then they have to make it affordable housing for 20 years. And I actually spoke to council in January asking why the land trust couldn't do this, and then when we met with folks from the land bank, they were like, well, it has to be a specific person. But then last week, with city council there, city council was like, well, you've had all these houses since October, why haven't you been able to sell them? And they're like, oh, it's kind of hard to find somebody who wants to be a landlord that only wants to own 1 or 2 homes, because that's part of the stipulation of this or only rent out 1 or 2 homes as part of the stipulation of the program. And then the land bank's, well, it's kind of hard to find somebody who wants to do that, so now we're contacting, well, then city council was like, well, let the land trust at least ask Enterprise if we can do this. So we're in communication with Enterprise to try to do that at this point. And the land bank has definitely were receptive to us when we met with them. So